Hello. Today I am going to talk about comic books and issues regarding these comic books and how the comic books have come of age. Now they are no longer, cultural artifacts that can be easily discarded or disregarded, but comic books, sometimes graphic novels, they have not only matured as far as their content is concerned, but quite like cinema, in fact, now they are being considered to be fit for serious critical inquiry. And the reason behind that is that comic books, whether they're very simple or very complex, whether they are almost trashy or they are representations of higher philosophical texts, they still carry the imprint of the age, the imprint of that culture. They carry definitive footprints of the politics of the time. So whether it does not really matter what the content of the particular text is, because that content can be very simple, yet that content can carry a lot of significance. Significance because, after all, they are a part of the history that they belonged to. You cannot really extricate them, you cannot really see them outside their historical, cultural, political contexts. So they become very, very significant artifacts, because popular culture manages to record the popular response to everything, whereas high culture would be recording the highbrow responses, the high intellectual ideals, which comic books or graphic novels can do actually, but they have not been considered to be fit for such attention for a long time, but we are slowly trying to change that. We are trying to look into them and look how they have developed, look how the readership of comic books have developed. And how comic books and comic book related cultural activities have now almost created a globalized kind of a space where the figure of Spider-Man is not alien to any of the cultures that are there on the planet. Almost all parts of the globe would be familiar with such a figure, with Superman, Supergirl, all the superhero ideas. Especially through the superhero ideas, this entire comic book Americanization, perhaps, if not only the greater idea of globalization, but this to a certain extent a kind of a neo-colonial program is being established through popular culture, popular media, and comic books are very much a part of that. It's a very subtle vanguard of a kind of a cultural invasion that we are now talking about. So comic books cannot really be disregarded, and we can no longer afford to disregard them. We have to look at them from this cultural study perspective. Now, in this discussion, I am not going to be overtly theoretical. I am just going to touch upon certain points, and I will perhaps refer to some ideas to some people who have been influential in understanding popular culture. I might just give you some quotations in as slides, and let's see how this progresses. Now, of course, bringing something to canon is a very lengthy and difficult process. Everybody who is a student of cinema would know this, that it has taken a very long time for cinema to become, well, quote unquote, respectable. So it always was. I mean, if you look at a film like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, can you not pay enough attention to it? You have to. Just like that, it may not be that highbrow, even the lowbrow comic books, as I have already mentioned, are now presenting their potentiality, presenting how significant they are in our understanding of immediate and not so immediate political history. In this process of canon inclusion, in the very process of canon formation, of course, we know there is a lot of political ideology that comes into play, and to bring the popular within the canon is not an easy task. But that is happening. I was talking about superheroes, but graphic novels like Mouse, or texts that we consider as comic books like Tintin or Asterix, they are now within the canon, and they are now being taught, researched upon for a while now, and they are showing us how this popular culture is representing a lot of hegemonic and local and regional political ideas. When I say regional, I am not looking at any specific national kind of an identity, but in context of the global, these would be the regional ideas. And of course, the entire Eurocentric kind of dominant position is quite often seen in these texts, and of course the US-centric ideas. But I will come to that in a few minutes. Now, these popular texts, they have this advantage. If you are to align with the so-called refined, with the so-called highbrow, then there are certain formulaic or certain demands as far as form and content are concerned, which are to be met. But the popular does not have the burden of becoming significant from that point of view. The popular does not have that responsibility. It does not have to become refined, cultured, etc. It can be the popular. It can be of the people. It can be for the people. It doesn't have to be, well, the alienated eyebrow that is raised always and that is looking down on everything that is not canonized, that is not accepted as the great, etc., so on and so forth. So being in that space, it can actually often be politically incorrect, or it can be politically correct, but it can be politically active. It doesn't have to be objective. It doesn't have to look at only the higher concerns, thinking that the immediate popular concerns are not worth their time. I mean, a lot of theatre has evolved now. A lot of theatre which had immediate political issues have now become classics because they have grown above them. And within the popular contest, the popular political, we have that possibility, because the political remains the political, whether it's micro-political or macro-political, whether it's interpersonal politics or larger, international politics. It remains the same, and that politics can be read and understood through all these texts. Now, one complaint that these popular texts had to face for a long time, that they were not even worthy of being called children's literature. Children's literature is a very complicated, complex kind of an entity. It has the canonized children's literature which is there in the social canon, which is sanctioned by the cultural powers that be. They have a lot of angles to them. They are not simply texts for children. This is something that we are tremendously aware of now. They are designed to create certain values. They are designed to instill certain values within the fresh young minds. They are designed to condition. And there are essentially 4 ideas that we associate with so-called good children's literature. Number 1, the value, the educative value, that they would educate these children somehow or the other. They will educate these children about other cultures, about how to behave, about general knowledge about their country, their culture, the history of their nation, or even the history of the world. Science, perhaps, to a certain extent. There would be popular science books, and children's literature would often include these ideas. And so education, and comic books have taken up that role to a certain extent. With the pictorial representations, bringing somebody closer to another culture is now easier. Just a text which you read will ask you to imagine and create that particular visual cultural space within your mind, and you may not be able to do that perfectly. There might be some mistakes, some imperfections. But when you see a comic book or a graphic novel, the pictures, the panels, they would present those elements as accurately possible. If they are not presenting them as accurately as possible, then there is a reason behind it. They would be talking about, there would be linguistic issues, there would be pure cultural issues which would differ. So the reader would be able to look at them and see that otherness, appreciate that otherness, not be xenophobic, not be afraid of the other, not be alien to these other possibilities. So these pictorial representations, these panels, they have that value. In fact, the second point, the language learning issue, and this is where I am very, very grateful to my parents, because my parents believed that language learning can happen very, very well through popular culture. because at that point of time they allowed me to read a lot of comics. I had this enviable collection of comic books which I never took to school, because I learned it early that once you take a comic book to school, you lose it basically. Your friends are your friends, but they become too friendly with the comic books, and there is a heavy chance that you would part quite sadly with that particular position of yours. So anyway, because the reason behind that is that all households did not have the same outlook. Most households thought that comic books were trash. The young minds were supposed to read only the sanctioned books, whether they were children's books or they were classics or whatever, that sanctioned idea. So I was lucky. I had a huge number of comic books, and they helped me in learning a lot of stuff, including language. Language is not just something that you acquire through interaction. You acquire a lot of language through popular culture and popular media. All that language may not be savory always, but you have to be open to it. You have to know what is there, what is right, what is wrong, what are the possibilities. So that kind of language learning, particularly English as a foreign language, and a lot of English comic books, they were more interesting rather than dry texts. So I had a lot of English comic books which actually did help. And of course I had a lot of Indian comic books as well, Bengali comic books as well. And through them I could learn wit, I could learn humor. And anyway, enough about me and my comic books, but this is the possibility that is there, and this is the possibility that people are opening up to now. This is no longer as great a taboo as it was when I was young. Tintin was there, Asterix was too intellectual. Anyway, Tintin was simpler, but Tintin also was quite expensive at that time. And the translations of Tintin were very good. But the point was, of course, when I say translations, I mean the Bengali translation of Tintin was very good. But the point was to learn English. Tintin in English is in translation. So I wish I could read the originals, because that wit, particularly Asterix, the wit that is there in the translation is brilliant by itself. And the original must be equally, if not more, witty. So that kind of appreciation also comes through such popular culture. And that is the possibility. And these are one of the many possibilities of reading comic books. The third point that they say about children's literature is that it teaches socialization. Now, socialization, how, you would ask, how are we learning to socialize? Because once again, the pictorial representations, they show us what kind of social living is possible elsewhere. And you no longer are shocked by certain specific cultural expressions, but you are aware of them, you are open to them. They may not be there in your culture. You know that they are not in your culture. It's not like they are teaching you to be like that. But you know that such is possible. So that possibility. And you know that when you are going to a foreign culture, you would not be shocked. You would not be taken aback. You would not respond in a very prudish kind of a way or whatever. So such socialization ideas, they can also be there. I am not an expert in education of children, so I'm just giving you certain theoretical points. You would be able to think about them independently. The fourth point that they talk about is acculturation. This acculturation idea is the most interesting idea. I have been talking about foreign cultures, but children's literature creates a cultural space which is familiar, which is to be emulated, which is to be learned. That is one of the values that local children's literature have, and it's a very valuable thing, it's a very necessary thing. But along with that acculturation, you can also learn about other cultures, you can also learn about other regions. In a country like India, so many regional cultures are there, and you can be aware of those regions, and you would know that you should not have the superiority complex of belonging to one region and look at the other regions, look down at the other regions and have jokes at their expenses, etc. You should know that you can also be a butt of ridicule. So that acculturation, but along with that, this acculturation, there can be the limiting influence as well. When you would be taught that certain cultures are good, certain cultures are bad, certain cultures are regressive, whereas what you are being taught might be regressive in itself. So that kind of possibility through children's literature and through comic books, that kind of possibility is there, and once again I will be talking about that in a few minutes. It's not only about the superheroes and stuff. The comic book idea goes far deeper than that. So that I will be talking about. And see, entertainment, the value of entertainment is what I am trying to get at, because all these four elements can be there in comic books. They can be very valuable because infotainment sort of a thing. You get a lot of information, you get entertainment, you get a lot of education, not in the structured way of course, but through these. And people have, even Rabindranath, even all the young minds that are to be taught, that pictorial element, that idea, from Rabindranath onwards, and even before that, we have had a huge number of such texts which have tried to pictorially influence the younger minds. The comic books are a different space. They, through a different kind of a narrative, they do the same thing. But why are we afraid of them? Because along with the same thing, the popular can carry the resistance as well. On the one hand, if they are culturally aligned to certain ideas, they can also culturally challenge certain specific ideas, and those challenges are not always acceptable. And this is one of the major points with popular culture, and specifically with comic books. Why people resist comic books? Those who do, that number has reduced remarkably, quite thankfully. But still there is this resistance. When I was young, as I said, centuries back, then this resistance was far stronger. But they are now lesser. But the point is, through these comic books, certain ideas can be introduced which you might like, which you might not like. They might be as superficial or simple as certain behavioral patterns that certain cultures do not like. They might teach children some kind of independence which certain sections of the society would not like. But also they might have a subtle political comment which might become dangerous for the powers that be. They might become dangerous for the structure that is creating the canons, the structure that is creating this whole syllabi thing, where you have certain specific agendas, cultural and political. So these are there, and that is why there is this resistance, because the comic books can introduce many things through form and content. Because form and content, like all other art forms, both form and content become immensely relevant here. Right, because they, through the form, can say a lot. Just like high art, just like literature, the form also says a lot, not only the content but the form as well. But in case of comic books, the form is more immediate, it is more visually striking. The panels, the coloring, there is a politics of coloring as well. How much can you afford, how colorful, bicolor or four color or so on and so forth. Whether you have black and white prints. Earlier Moyuk Chaudhuri comics used to come in black and white because they could not afford colored prints. They were far too expensive at that point of time. When Indrojal comics came, they had colors, limited, not as colorful, not print technology was not as advanced at that point of time. So those are also economic, political ideas that are relevant, but other than that, there are choices whether to keep it in black and white or to keep it in color. Color would attract more readership, quite obviously. That is why even bicolor would do. If you go back to the earlier Hada Boda or Batul the Great, such comics, if you are in West Bengal, if you are in this part of the country, then you would know them. Or if the very early Chacha Chaudhuri comic books, if you look at them, when the Indian comic books were coming of age, then you would see that they were looking at a different kind of format. The newspapers carried black and white comics. That is how the comic books came into the household every day, because practically all newspapers which did not carry them would be dry newspapers, would be considered too serious, and children would not like them. At least 2 or 3 panels of Tintin or of the Phantom or so on and so forth. There would be something or the other, even Blondie, right? Weekends there would be larger magazines and stuff like that which would have comic books, comic sections. Even the autumn annuals, the Puja Varshikis, would have comic representations, right? A figure as popular as Feluda would have a comic. The classics around the world in 80 days, and they would have representations through comic books, and they would popularize these classics even more. People who could not read that entire text, language often becomes prohibitive, but these comic books, through the panels and through the blurb, those clouds of thought, etc., they would be much more accessible, fewer sentences, less to read, and you of course are missing the storytelling of the original, but the story is told in a different manner. It's a different kind of storytelling, but the story ends up being told. So it's a kind of translation. So if you're translating from English or French or German to Bengali or Hindi, etc., you are translating them into a visual kind of a language, along with some dialogues, etc., monologues or dialogues, exchanges. So that is another kind of translation that we are speaking about, a translation which is more accessible, which is quite possible for more people. So that, and if you, as I said, if you think about those Batul the Great or Hada Bodha issues, and if you think about mouse, then you would know that this is a text which is deliberately presenting its story in that form. It's a densely packed storytelling, and the representations of cats and mice, the entire Nazi story that is being told. Art Spiegelman is doing this absolutely fascinating job by creating this entire non-humanized portraiture. Because on the one hand, the Jews become mice, subhuman they are thought, and even the Nazis cannot be called human. That is why they also become the hunters, the cats. And that representation to tell a story which is as significant, which is as painful, as impactful as this entire historical idea of the Holocaust. It's a brilliant work of art. One cannot simply limit it as popular culture. Or as a graphic novel which is of no consequence. It's not possible. There are so many parsipolis. I mean, there are so many texts like that available now. People are expressing everything through this particular form, and along with that, the historical value. If we are talking about mouse, then this entire construct has this tremendous historical value, because through this you can tell a story which is much more difficult to tell, which is truly difficult to tell, because this is one of the darkest images of humanity that you can think of, the darkest bits of history of humanity. And through comic books, it can be presented in a new and much more brilliant way. But the form, the black and white form, the panels, the breakings, the gutters, everything, how they mingle, how they jump from one to the other. You can take a look at these and you will understand what I am saying. Through the form, the content is enhanced to the level of brilliance. And that is why they become so valuable. On the other hand, if you think about Amar Chitrakatha, of course, Nandini Chandra's book is definitive. It's a fascinating book. The classic popular, that is the book. If you are interested in studying about Amar Chitrakatha, you cannot not take a look at that book. The Amar Chitrakatha paradigm had a very different kind of a strategy. It was all about establishing Indian culture. It was all about bringing the ancient and the not so ancient Indian culture to the realm of the children, along with Chand Mama, which was a slightly different thing altogether. They would be bringing all these ideas to children, That is absolutely fine. The style of painting that was emulated, which over the years changed, and you can understand, you look at the number of the texts and there is a gradual development that you can see. Once again, I am not an expert on this, on Amar Chitra Katha. There are plenty of people who are, and if you read the book, then you would be quite familiar, you would become familiar with these ideas. But the point is the strategy, the politics that was there of not only acculturation, but a specific kind of acculturation. Through that acculturation, certain cultures were denied their rightful place in the history of the country. And that was the motive. There was a long-term political idea that was there behind Amar Chitra Katha. They were presenting figures from history, but specific figures from history. Very few other figures were included. The other that I am speaking of is everything that is non-Hindu. The other that I am speaking of are women. And although you would say there are so many, there are so many texts on these famous women figures, some of them are called the legend of someone, the story of someone, so on and so forth. The historical value is often very subtly challenged. They are mythified. Their actuality is kept in a grey area, which you would not consciously recognize perhaps. But there is this sentiment, there is this issue. But see, gender representation becomes this huge problem as far as Amar Chitra Katha is concerned. And not only this gender representation, but religious ideals, religious figures. And the problem is, Amar Chitra Katha is thought to be the representation of Indian culture to the globe, to the younger audience all around the globe. And that is a problem because it is also packaging Indian culture as a primarily Hindu culture. And that presentation is outbound as well as inbound. The readers within the country and the readers outside the country, they are all reading it, they are all reading into it. And this of course has been discussed quite often, in fact, and everyone who is aware of this. And so this is what comic books can do. They can create this model of acculturation, and they can deny certain factors. They can erase almost certain factors from being. So that is there. Of course, if we are talking about that kind of representation, Amar Chitra Katha looks a little dated nowadays. And of course, the local flavor, when you read, once again, if I speak about Bengali comic books like, Hada Buddha or Batul the Great, you would see there are not only very Bengali ideas which are included in this, but there are also certain challenges. As my young friend Arjo Rishi tells me, that if you look at the Batul the Great figure, the figure of Batul the Great, you would see how it challenges the Western superhero idea. It's a very different kind of a construct. If you look at the figure of the very masculine and muscular Superman, Batman sort of figures, and if you look at Batul, you would see how tremendously different Batul is, and Batul is a superhero. There is not really an origin story as such. I don't recall one. If there is, please let me know. But bullets bounce off his skin. He is extremely strong. He eats 30 eggs a day, etc., so on and so forth. And it's so remarkably, incredibly dissimilar to the superhero paradigm that we have been given, and more so recently. We are so incredibly happy with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU, which has become an expression, recognizable expression now. And that has a particular formula, that has a particular paradigm, which is, even in the 60s, this was challenged by Narayan Devnath, and he was doing something very difficult, very different, and he was turning it into something very popular. Even Hada Bhuda or Nonte Fonte perhaps, they presented Bengaliness in a very different way. They presented not only Bengaliness, but also certain wish fulfillment scenarios. In those stories, if you see, there are things that happen that do not generally happen to ordinary children. But that wish fulfillment, that fantasy element is very much a part of those texts. And as I said, the Bengaliness that is there, that is being presented to the readers, that is also very, very valuable. The localness, the regional flavor, the regional identity, that is very much there. I am not sure if these comic books would be appreciated all over the country similarly. I am not very sure whether they will be acceptable to people belonging to other cultures, because they have very specific cultural traits. They're targeted, designed for a specific readership. So that is something that we need to recognize as well. They are not designed to be national or international. Unlike the Western comic books that are coming to us, even if they speak about truth and justice and the American way, we are still going gaga over Superman. Now they're dropping that American way stuff because Superman has become much more global. And talking about this global idea, this entire superhero culture, this from He-Man, I have the power, by the powers of Grayskull, I have the power kind of a thing, that hunger for power, that is something that we have been taught, that we need to have power. And this entire superhero framework works with this idea of capitalistic personal property element, because they all protect personal property. They speak about protecting choices, they speak about giving people the right to choose, etc. They speak a lot, but at the end of the day, they are all guards of the structures that they belong to. they do nothing against that, even if the structure is corrupt, or if the structure is no longer functioning, but still they will. Only occasionally do you see certain challenges. Even somebody as dark as Batman would be all about obeying the law. The law might be against him, but he will have this code of conduct. He would be about justice. Justice that the law cannot give, but justice structured. The vigilantism, which is very strangely this unique American, the US kind of a model. The masked vigilante, the dual identity thing, which they are breaking, which the MCU is slowly going beyond that, trying to at least go beyond that. And this is something that I have noticed over the last few years, that they are not liking this binary, this dual identity thing. They are moving towards this single identity format. I don't know why. One can think about it. The progression in politics, they need not hide themselves anymore. They can be open about their violence. They can be open about their intrusion. The entire Captain America Civil War was about this particular issue, that whether they can interfere elsewhere or not, whether they have become gods, etc. It did not resolve the issue quite adequately, and people, the heroes, were very upset because they were told to obey certain rules and laws. They were told they were not over and above the law. So anyway, let me not talk about that too much. But this idea of the whole project that began with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who were these Jewish boys in the 1930s in the US, which was very, very anti-Semitic. And their expression of frustration came through this figure who was wearing red and blue. And this figure who could not fly, incidentally, at the time, you know this, and who could jump above higher buildings. A few days back I was watching one of the early cartoons, Superman cartoons, and Superman could not fly in them. So that was quite interesting. If you are into these golden age, early age phases, then this is very interesting. But the point is, over time, the idea of Superman was appropriated by mass culture and by the political structure, and Superman was turned into the spokesperson for American greatness, and to a certain extent a spokesperson for the neo-colonial ideas that are now ruling the earth, that they can just about go anywhere. Nobody is going to stop them as long as that person is Superman. So each and every American would feel that they are basically Superman, and they can just about do anything, go anywhere, etc. That model, that kind of military presence, that kind of hegemony that we have in the world order these days. And so Superman is growing out of that. The whole idea is now different. The fact that he is an immigrant, the fact that he is settling and serving an alien planet and an alien country, that was a different kind of an immigration story at one point of time. It has changed significantly now. They touch upon that because the immigration idea is still a hugely problematic idea, and the figure of Superman can be utilized to present certain ideals that if you are an immigrant, if you have come to this country, then this is how you need to be: good, loyal, just, upholding the values of your adopted country, so on and such. So that much is very important. And you know, we grew up with three major figures. One is the superhero called Phantom, the Phantom. Then we had Tintin, and we had Asterix. These three are very, very different from each other. When I say Phantom, I mean generally the individual comics pattern where Phantom, Mandrake, Flash Gordon, Bahadur was the one Indian, not quite a superhero, but the one Indian protagonist figure who was there. But we were fascinated with the magician Mandrake and the science fiction exploits of Flash Gordon, and of course the Phantom. And there were crossovers sometimes, not Flash Gordon, but Mandrake and Phantom, they would be appearing in stories that belong to the other one. And they would be, we would be fascinated when Phantom is getting married, Mandrake is invited, the latest Phantom. And the Phantom story is so incredibly colonial, so incredibly white supremacist, because the premise is that this is a man who has been protecting the forests of Bengala, which Lee Falk, I think, he was thinking of Bengal and it became Bangala or something like that. And he was not quite proficient in geography. So anyway, and the Bandar tribes from Bandar. So once again, there are so many things that you can kind of think about in these texts. And the Phantom is actually not the immortal man that he is presenting himself to be. He is basically, the father dies and the son takes up the costume, the purple weird costume, which we were so fascinated with, because at that time the Phantom was this great hero, and he had no superpowers. He had a lot of skill. He lived in this skull cave, and they were all iconic for us when we were young. But this Phantom, he was essentially cheating people, because the one Phantom would die, the second Phantom, then the third Phantom, to the 21st Phantom. So many generations of Phantoms. And the Africans were so ignorant. They were so uncivilized that they could believe in the godliness of this particular character. And in story after the other, you would see that these tribal people are so many afraid of iron birds. They have never seen a plane, so they are absolutely terrified. And such Western elements would be utilized to defeat the evil tribals. There would be good tribals who will be pro-Phantom, then there would be evil tribals who would be cheating Westerners, who would be cheating everybody. And there were some brilliant stories. I mean, for me, the value is nostalgic. It's all nostalgia. Even when I read these comic books now, I can't really be objective because my entire childhood is there in them. So, but even when I think about them, I can see how problematic these plots, stories were. There were this sense of superiority, the white man superior than everybody else, and this white man who had sworn revenge against pirates, do very little against pirates in fact, but he is practically a god, he is practically a ruler, he has a throne in fact, and it's so incredibly problematic. You can think about them. Tintin is definitely hugely problematic. The entire Eurocentric idea when Tintin in Tibet, when Chang is lost, Tintin has this spiritual kind of a connect with him. And he is to be rescued by Tintin, by this European journalist who is rarely reporting. And he would go on an adventure, and money is never a question. He can fly a plane, he can shoot. These are brilliant stories and completely enjoyable. But if you think about them, he can just about go anywhere because of his Europeanness. And he will find support, he will find enemies. And in Tintin in Tibet, there are many problems in representation. Tintin in Congo, I think, which was not really publicized, which was not presented to the world for the longest period of time because it was so incredibly problematic. There are political comments, of course. Tintin in America, we see that oil-filled thing. So there are certain elements to support, but then there are so many things which show this amazingly Eurocentric kind of a worldview where Europe, this entire Eurocentric superiority thing is established. Right, the young minds who would read Tintin, they would think of Tintin as somebody superior. They would not be able to identify with Tintin quite always. With Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus, the entire trio has this very European, of course, we are looking at it from a post-colonial kind of neo-imperial kind of an outlook. For them, if I go into that us-them kind of a thing, these are enjoyable stories. These are stories of the world where they go and they essentially conquered the world once again. They go everywhere, all the problems are solved by them, whichever the problems might be, whatever the problems might be, and the locals can rarely solve the problems, from aliens to civil war. All kinds of stories are there in Tintin. And of course, culturally, spiritually, that kind of superiority is very much a problem. And Tintin, of course, is there in a lot of syllabi these days. So Tintin is a familiar idea. Now, the whole idea of comic books then, it reaches a much larger audience. And because it reaches that audience and it is seldom taken very seriously, it can function as this ideological state apparatus, as Althusser had said. So that ISA thing is possible, but it can function in both ways. It can support the state, it can go against the state. In Asterix, we have so much anti-imperial ideas. In Asterix, there is quite a few instances where you have statements which are fascinating, which speak about cultural resistance, which speak about not bowing down to this global imperial pressure. There are problems, but then the biggest positive that you can associate with Asterix is that everything is seen with a pinch of salt. Everything is seen through humor, and they are laughing at themselves. Uderzo and Goscinny, they are laughing at the French constructs as well. It's not like they are laughing at everybody else and not at themselves. They are laughing at themselves as well. And that is the biggest pro you can find in this world of cons. So that is brilliant. That is something that counter-culture, counter-politics can use. And once again, the structure would be wary of that. The structure would not want to give due prominence to these texts because they can actually become tools or become tools in the other hand, in the hands of the opposition. So that is very much there. But the fear, of course, is that there can be populistic constructs as well. These texts can surrender to populism, and if that is done, they would show certain good things as bad. They would say that certain isms are not really good. They would challenge gender consciousness. They would challenge. They would challenge the resistances themselves. They would demean in these worlds of trolling. They can become very, very significant tools in the hands of such media. And the capitalistic ideas, the patriarchal ideas can find proper expression through them, because they, if you look at these mythological stories, the idea of the ideal man and the ideal woman, the age-old hackneyed gender insensitive ideas are still there. They are being presented, they are being packaged very well, but they are being presented. So this is another kind of strategy. The general bigotry that is popular, that they can subscribe to, such populist measures can come. And what the study of comic books can do, what awareness about comic books can do, is that it can blur this distinction between the high and the low as far as cultures are concerned. Popular, the high culture and the popular culture. And see, the other thing is, comic books often pay tribute to classics. And through this, one can also see how one can support both. You can support comic books, you can be a fan of comic books, and you can be a fan of high culture, opera, or high philosophical texts. You need not choose one and become the enemy of the other. You can revere the high cultural text, and you can still like and appreciate, admire these comic books. There is no need for an enmity between these two. So let me end here. It's more than 1 hour now. Let me end by saying that the comic books they can and they do look at serious philosophical, emotional, political ideas, and we should look at them seriously. We should appreciate them as the popular, not only turn them into boring study materials, but enjoy them. But along with that, we can also admire them, appreciate them, and we can look back at the older comic books and see how they were culturally, politically, and historically relevant. I will stop here. Thank you so much.